All right, so so that'll be the November 29th makeup assignment. The last opportunity we have, I think that is also the last class. Just as a reminder, today we're in person and online. Wednesday's class is canceled for those who are online, if you didn't hear that. Next week, Monday's class is online because I have a scheduling conflict. And then Wednesday's class is in person and we'll have the makeup opportunity. Is that clear? Okay. There's kind of a lot of different threads to weave in. All right, so starting the topic today, migration and international relations. Basically, these are kind of the three questions that we're going over today. Definitions, why labels matter, who is migrating and why, where are people coming from and where are they going? Both of those depend on the previous two. So let's get started. So initially in international relations, when we're looking at migration as a topic, the traditional state-centered approach focuses on national security. So it's focused on borders, treats migrants as a category of people with security implications. That's the traditional approach in IR. The contemporary people-centered, remember we talked about human security approach, is to treat migrants as individuals, and it looks at the security threats that people face as they're migrating. So remember, again, this is like a levels of analysis issue. Like, are we looking at whose security counts? Remember, that was the theme that I started out with. Whose security counts? So are we talking about security for the state or security for people, individuals? So that's why that levels of analysis thing keeps coming back in. And that's why I teach it. Every time I teach it, sometimes I think, oh, maybe we should skip this. It's so abstract. But then, you know, we keep coming back to it as like, this is why we talk about the levels of analysis. So as what would this first one be? What level of analysis would that be? It's focused on the state.
Second level?
Second level, yeah. And then the human security, we call that
Is the first level?
first level, yeah. Like, who is the target? Who is the object that we're referring to? The state or individuals? So both are important, but they just look at different effects for different parties. So when we're talking about the big picture of everybody who goes to live in another country, then the number one reason why they do that is because of economics. And because, you know, refugees are only like 11% of that big number of everybody who has to move for various reasons. And although 146 nations agree to this definition, ultimately, what I was just saying is ultimately it's the host country, the country where people are going to, the host country decides how to label somebody as a refugee or asylum seeker. It's up to that individual country. But I will talk a little bit about how the US distinguishes, because the US has a kind of a weird thing. It depends on where you are when you apply for status. The distinction between refugees and asylum seekers. So refugees, if you are located outside of the US when you apply, then you're a refugee. If you are inside the United States when you apply, then you're called an asylum seeker. This relates to another point, which is that most refugees end up in neighboring countries. Okay, so which sort of makes sense if you think about like war has exploded in your home country and you're fleeing. It's hard to like flee across the world unless you have money. Some people do, but most people don't. So most refugees from the Syrian war, for example, ended up in Turkey. If you're fleeing war and violence and stuff, you just end up next door. So that's an important distinction to remember when you look at these two charts I have next. Here, you know, this again comes from the module's top 10 source countries. You can see number one source country is Syria. This was, you know, from 2019. And then the top 10 destinations, the number one destination country is the United States. That does not mean that most Syrian refugees end up in the United States. Does that make sense? This one is about crime statistics. So I sort of mentioned this a couple of weeks ago whenever we were first starting about security issues, but that undocumented immigrants tend to commit less crime than native-born citizens. And that's for like all crimes, homicide, larceny. Which sort of makes sense. Like I think I mentioned last time, especially if you are undocumented, you want to fly below the radar. You don't want to have any interactions with any kind of government. This is bad for public health reasons because it includes, you know, people being afraid to get healthcare because they don't want to have to interact with anything where they might get found out with their status. Also, they don't report crimes, which makes them very vulnerable to being victims of crime. The next one also, this is a really good, if y'all, how many of y'all into like quantitative, doing statistical analysis and stuff like this? This is some of the really interesting stuff. But it's not always this, data is not always this clear, which is unfortunate, but sometimes when it is, gosh, that's really clear. More undocumented immigrants means less violent crimes. So, and this is from a different study. This was published in the Journal of Criminology in 2018, that I also got from the blog on the Washington Post. So do places with higher percentages of undocumented immigrants have higher rates of crime? That's a really great research question. So there's another short podcast, not the one that's for the makeup a missed class assignment, but it's like a 7-minute news report on this came out when you know, various politicians were saying that migrants are a burden to the communities that they end up in. And it's a short interview with this person that's from this Migration Policy Institute. It's really interesting, good think tank in DC. It does research on stuff like this. And so their research question for this study was, yeah, how much of a burden are migrants on the communities that they end up in? So it just reminds people various things that probably already know. Illegal migrants, they're ineligible for public benefits like welfare and social security. The only public goods they can access are public education and access to emergency medical care. And like in Florida, where we have this thing now where they want the hospitals to ask people their migration status, that's going to even lower those numbers too. So, but migrants, whether they're legal or illegal, they still pay taxes just like everybody else when you buy stuff in a store. And if they're getting a paycheck, they have it taken out of their paychecks.